Welcome to the Unstuck Church podcast, where each week we're exploring what it means to be an unstuck church. Out of hundreds of service assessments, the Unstuck group has found that there are two key areas that set growing churches apart in the effectiveness of their weekend services. And it may not come as a surprise that a warm, intentional guest experience is one of them. On this week's podcast, Tony and Amy continue our series on common mistakes churches make on the weekend with a conversation about some of the issues we see in guest services. If you're brand new to the Unstuck Church podcast, before you listen, stop and go to the unstuckgroup.com/podcast to subscribe to get the episode show notes in your email. When you do, you're going to get resources to support each week's episode, including our leader conversation guide, access to our podcast resource archive, and some bonus resources you won't find anywhere else. Once again, that's the unstuckgroup.com/podcast to subscribe. Now, before this week's conversation, here's a word from Tony.
If you're like me, it's easy to feel like we have to do it all. But doing it all is not only impossible, it's a recipe for burnout. Great leaders know the secret to a long and healthy career in ministry is delegation. It's about prioritizing what only you can do and finding trusted talent to take on the rest. If you feel like you're overwhelmed trying to do it all, our friends at BELAY can help. BELAY is a modern church staffing organization with fractional US-based accounting and virtual assistant services. They've spent over a decade helping busy leaders just like you accomplish more and juggle less. To help you learn what you can start delegating today, BELAY is offering a free resource for you. It's the top 25 tasks a pastor can delegate to an assistant. Just text Unstuck, that's UNSTUCK, to 55123 to stop trying to do it all and start delegating with BELAY.
Well, welcome back to the Unstuck Church podcast. Last week, we launched a new series on mistakes you're making in your weekend experience. And Tony, will you catch us up to speed and introduce this week's topic?
Well, as I mentioned last week, over the last 4 years, our Unstuck consultants have been on the ground in I can't even believe it, more than 250 churches, helping evaluate their in-person Sunday experience. And this is everything from the parking lot and facilities to the message and the worship service itself. And we often see churches of all sizes and denominations making similar mistakes. Last week, Amy walked us through 5 common mistakes we see in the area of worship services. But in the coming weeks, we're going to be talking about guest services, kids ministry, and facilities. And then not only talk about the mistakes, but more importantly, talk about some solutions to elevate your weekend experience. This week, we're going to be focusing on guest services. And this is going to be pretty fun, Amy.
Yeah, Tony, I've done enough secret shoppers at churches through the years to know that this is a much needed topic of conversation. And to help us with this topic today, we have a special guest joining us.
Yeah, that's correct. And this really is a special guest. The guest today is Chad Hunt. Chad's a good friend, but he's also the lead pastor of Victory Hill Church, which is near Bowling Green, Kentucky. So I think it's about as close as you can get to the Kentucky-Tennessee border. So now you might understand when you hear Chad a little bit of his accent. But Chad has also served on the Unstuck team for many years as one of our ministry consultants. And through that experience, he's worked with over 100 churches and done some of these secret shopper experiences where he's had the opportunity to see firsthand what churches are doing as it relates to guest services. So needless to say, Chad has visited many churches and out of that experience has lots of wisdom to share when it comes to first-time guest experiences. So with that introduction, here's my conversation with Chad. Chad, thanks for joining us for this podcast series. We're talking about weekend services and some of the key components of a great experience on the weekends for churches. And today I wanted to talk with you specifically about guest services for a couple of reasons. Number one, you're at a great church that's very intentional about guest services. But then secondly, your kind of side gig is with the Unstuck group. You're one of our best ministry consultants. You've been with us for years. And because of that, through the Unstuck process, you've done probably more than 100, I'm guessing. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Kind of secret shopper experiences where you're going to different churches on Sunday morning. So first, kind of give us your backstory as it relates to your church and the Unstuck group and the secret shopper experience. And then, like I said, I want to dive into some specific questions as it relates to guest services today.
Well, Tony, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. And yeah, you're right. It's been, I think, I actually did a count, and counting the churches that I worked with before Unstuck, I think I'm at 146 and that includes coaching as well. So that's just not on the ground. Secret shopper experiences, it's has to be close to 100 because I think this is my ninth year with the Unstuck group, and
Wow.
I'm just so thankful to be a part of a great team.
Well, like I said, Chad, I do want to talk a little bit about then the specific mistakes that we often see. And I guess partly the conversation today is I want you to confirm, do you see these same mistakes? And then if so, maybe elaborate on how churches can pivot and maybe rethink how they're approaching guest services as it relates to these 5 areas that we're going to cover. And beginning with the lack of leadership. And let me explain that. What I see in many churches is that it feels like either everyone owns it, and because of that, no one owns guest services, or the second thing that sometimes we see is the worship team owns it. And what we've learned when the worship team owns guest services, which kind of intuitively makes sense because it's all part of the guest experience on Sunday mornings, both outside and inside the auditorium. But what we've learned is when the worship team owns it, they're so focused on the service, the worship service itself, that oftentimes, the guest service experience gets neglected. So that's the first mistake I wanted to kind of talk through is that lack of leadership. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I remember something, Tony, you said a long time ago. I'm not sure if you coined this, but I heard it first from you, and you said it. Hope is not a strategy, and I think that's so true when it comes to our hospitality strategy. What I've learned in working with churches is most churches count on this organic hospitality. They just kind of hope that it happens versus intentional hospitality. And I think that in order for intentional hospitality to happen, two things have to occur. Number one, as you said, there has to be a leader just for it, and there has to be a team for hospitality. And oftentimes, what we find is that, as you said, no one really owns it. So, if someone's going to own it, be the leader, that means there's a job description, there's expectations, there's the right engagement in the right places and the right language, and all of those things. And I think most importantly, when I think about the lack of leadership, even those churches that have intentional leadership, where they always drop the ball, is what I feel like is the most important opportunity, and that is the post-service hospitality. I tell our church all the time that on the front end, let's celebrate. On the back end, let's conversate. They've went through church, they've lived to tell about it, and now maybe they're open for a conversation. And so that post-service hospitality is a big factor, but none of those things happen if we just hope that it happens through this ooey gooey organic, hospitality strategy.
I love that. All right, here's the second mistake. Let me see if you can confirm this for me as well, because I have stories to share to support this. I've seen churches that are friendly, but they're not welcoming. I've actually experienced this as I've done some secret shoppers in the past, Chad, but has that been your experience as well?
Oh yeah, it has. And and I'm reminded of Gary McIntosh that said that friendliness is the number one reason that people come back to church for a second time. And so many people just don't understand that, or at least they ignore that fact. Friendliness being defined as the number of conversations that people have with someone when they're in the building. So there was one church in particular that I was engaged with their Unstuck process. And during our strategic planning time, one of the team members informed me they were the friendliest church in their state. I mean, they're like, we are so friendly that you're going to be walked in. They're going to take you to the coffee bar. You're going to be invited to 3 or 4 small groups. So we just want you to be prepared for that. I'm like, okay. Because Tony, I'm sure like you've heard this before as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure
Mm-hmm.
everyone thinks they're friendly. So I pull into the guest parking. No one comes to get me. So I finally get out, go in the building. I stand there for about 7 minutes because I time these things. No one approaches me, even though there's lots of people in this really nice lobby talking, engaging. Finally, I go to the coffee bar, and the lady at the coffee bar is like, "Oh, so you're new?" I'm like, "I am." And she goes, "Well, I have a cup just for you, just for guests." I'm going, thank you. And so I get this really nice first time guest mug, and I go stand back in the same location. And there's a flat screen above the worship center that's a timer for the auditorium to open.
Mhm.
And I'm there for 11 minutes. I have this actually in writing. I'm there for 11 minutes and 36 seconds, and not one person, although there's many people in the room, they do not approach me. And finally, in my peripheral, I see the coffee bar lady dart into the worship center. And what I didn't know is her husband was part of that planning team that weekend.
Okay.
And she goes in and she says to her husband, she said, "There's a weird guy in the lobby just standing there. We need to call security." He comes out, he sees me. He's like, "Oh man, get in here." Same thing happened in the worship center when the pastor got up and asked people to turn and greet their friends and welcome guests. Not one person greeted me. And so it really comes to this principle that it's very possible to be friendly with each other and not be friendly with others.
Mm.
And it feels friendly, it feels warm and fuzzy. But again, without that intentionality, and what I tell our church is, do not look for first time guests. Look for people who you do not know their first name. That is the target. Because once a church gets past a certain size, you can't recognize guests. Matter of fact, I hope every church gets to a place they can't recognize guests. It means they're growing. And so we have to have intentionality about engaging people who we do not know their name. And without that, it can really feel friendly because church people are friendly to each other. But the people we're trying to reach, the loneliest place for a person to be is in a large room full of Christians talking to their Christian friends, and they feel utterly alone. And that's really easy for them to make the decision not to return.
Yeah. All right. So a third mistake that we run into many, many times, and I get it because building teams, finding volunteers for all of these necessary roles in guest services on Sunday morning, that's a big task for any church. But it's just that many churches, when it comes to guest services, don't have enough people on the team. And even if they do have enough people, many times they're not obvious because they're not wearing something, I'll call it a uniform, some way to distinguish that team from anybody else in the church. So, what are your thoughts on that, Chad?
Yeah, and that reminds me again of something that you mentioned, Tony, in a podcast. That if you want to know how important uniforms are, put on an orange shirt and go to a Home Depot and see what happens. And I think that's so true with hospitality. That they need to be highly visible. That people need to be able to readily identify them. And the other thing I would say too, especially when we don't have enough people on the teams, it just means that we're not preparing for our guests well. And one thing that I tell churches, and I even tell our own church, is that we have to prepare for the guests today who aren't here yet.
Hmm.
And I think that's just a principle of stewardship, but it really does two things. When we have people easily identified, when we have intentional hospitality, it does a couple of things. Number one, it teaches our church that we value guests. So the people who are coming, they know we value them. And therefore, they know what a guest experience looks like when we encourage them to bring their friends. But also, number two, it really begins to bleed into the culture of the church that our culture, the thing that we want to establish at our church is simply this: one invite can change a life. And if we believe that, then we need to be ready for when those friends come. We need to make sure that people are engaged in the right places, in the right spaces, with the right conversation, that it's not weird, and that there's the right steps for those people to take. And so I think that you're exactly right, that if we don't lead today, like where we know we're going tomorrow, we're going to miss a great opportunity. And man, first time guests, you got one shot to make them feel welcome. You've got one shot to make them understand that we really want you to be here.
Yeah, and so when we're talking about enough people for the team, think about really beginning in the parking lot. Are there volunteers welcoming guests at the
Hmm.
front door, in your lobby space, at the auditorium doors or your sanctuary doors? Are there people there to welcome people into the sanctuary? Inside the auditorium, I think about ushers inside to help people get to their seats or find seats. Assuming you have a help
Hmm.
desk or something, some place for people to get questions answered, especially if they're first time guests, and probably many more opportunities beyond that. But we really need to have enough folks in all of these spaces to welcome guests and encourage them, not only to enjoy the experience, but then to answer any specific questions that they might have.
Hmm.
And If you forget what that's like, I would encourage you to actually go to another church that's maybe outside your faith tradition and experience that for the first time through a
Mm.
guest's eyes, because that might give you fresh perspective on the intentionality that you at your church have to have as well. Okay.
Hey, Tony, I remember once when I went to Walmart and there was a lady at the front door and she said, "Good morning, how are you?" And I said, "I'm fine, how are you?" And she said, "I'm fine." And it dawned on me that she probably really didn't care how I was, and I didn't care how I just wanted to get in and get out. And I'm reminded that while door greeters are important, very important, we need those people opening doors and welcoming people, but the hospitality has to exceed the front door.
Mm.
And what we've established at our church, we call them weekend ninjas. And so we have people who are identified with shirts. We have people that wear the lanyards, and we have, section hosts and all those things. But we also have ninjas, and these are people that we charge. We ask them. We want you to produce radical hospitality, and that's basically engaging people you don't know. They're not wearing a lanyard. They're not, in other words, it's not their job or their duty, that we're that friendly.
Mm.
And our weekend ninjas have done an amazing job in creating. The thing I've learned about hospitality is it's contagious. And when people start doing it, even when our ninjas and the people that are identified, it almost begins to, again, bleed into that culture and becomes this contagious thing that our entire church begins to embrace.
I love that idea, Chad. I want to be on the ninja team. That sounds like fun.
Yeah, who don't want to be a ninja?
Yeah, let's talk about the fourth area, which is not being prepared specifically for young families with kids. In other words, when a family shows up and they have preschoolers, if they have newborns, if they have elementary aged kids, especially, are we prepared for that family when they come in? Because there's just the unknown obviously is there for the parents, but it's compounded by the fact that they want to make sure their kids are going to be safe. It's going to be a secure space, that they're going to have fun in that experience as well. So, give us some guidance on how to prepare for young families with kids, Chad.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I want to just say, especially with stuck churches, a lot of the stuck churches that we engage with, especially smaller churches, their number one obstacle is they don't have any children yet,
Mm.
or they have very few. And they feel like, well, we really don't need the nursery. We don't have, again, we have to lead today like we know we're going tomorrow. And I think some of the obstacles that really hurts this young family appeal is, number one is, I mean, I'll just say, even the decor. I've been in children's ministries. It looks like a hospital or a nursing home, and there's no color, there's nothing appealing to kids. There, nothing looks fun. Um, I think that the four things that really have to be right for kids ministry, that is, number one, and I think this is in order. I could be wrong here. I'm not a children's pastor. I would be a horrible children's pastor. But I think in this order is, number one, it has to be fun. And that fun is more than just the experience. That's also the environment.
Right.
Irresistible environments that are compelling, that children want to go to. Number two is it has to be safe. And while it needs to be safe, not only for the kids, but the parents need to feel that safety more than anyone else. There needs to be the child check-in. How will you notify me in case that my child needs me? And by the way, if the answer is we'll come find you, horrible answer.
Mm.
We need some kind of professional way to notify, and there's lots of options for that. Thirdly, it needs to be gospel centered. So while we want them to have fun, we want them to learn about Jesus. That's important. And then lastly, it has to be organized. And, if it's not organized, then I feel sorry for the people that's serving in children's ministry. But all of those things really is what creates, at the end of the day, it creates the opportunity for when mom and dad get in the car and when dad looks over his shoulder and says, "Well, kids, what did you think?" And either they love it or they hate it. And chances are, if they hate it, they're not coming back, because the old principle is, if you win the kids, you win the city. And so kids ministry is that important, that we need that experience where kids want to come back, because many parents, whether right or wrong, whatever your beliefs are, many parents will shop churches and determine their church home based on what's in it for the kids.
Chad, as you were talking about that, I was reminded of a visit to a church years ago. And actually, Emily, my wife, and our kids were with us. And we had checked in the kids into the children's ministry space, it seemed great. my experience at the end of the service, though, was kind of funny and scary at the same time. As I was picking up my child, I noticed there was a clipboard that was being passed through the checkout line with all the parents. And
Oh, wow.
as I learned, they were asking the parents in the line to sign up to serve in the children's ministry area. And I'm thinking, oh goodness, they
Oh,
have
wow.
no idea who's in this line. They have no idea who I am. Here I am on my very first Sunday at this church, and they're asking me to serve in the children's ministry area. And so, needless to say,
Wow.
I didn't bring my kids back to that church. But when it comes to communicating great experience for especially a first time family, and then especially the safety and security, we really need to be thinking about intentional strategies there. And don't worry, Chad, we'll be talking about children's ministry separately with somebody that does that all the time in this series as well. So, but those are great
Good.
insights that you shared from the perspective of a pastor at a church as well. All right, last thing. It's just, and this is, I know, something that your church is very good at. The mistake that we see is asking guests to take big steps. And when I talk about big steps, it's like, if you're new here, stand up. If you're new here, join
Mm.
our membership. If you're new here, connect into a group or a serving team or give to the church. Those are big steps to ask someone that's brand new to the church. I know your church approaches this very differently. So could you walk us through that?
Yeah. So, and you're right, Tony. One thing that just in my learning and of not only working with churches, but it's even our own church, is that guests aren't coming to buy the car; they come in to kick the tires. And
Mm,
too often, churches, their first step is so large, or it feels like it's so much commitment. No one's going to take that. And I remember when I first came to our church, we didn't really have a path. The first step was like a 4-week class or something like that. There's places for classes. I'm not saying you can't do classes. You can't do 4-week studies or any kind, some kind of a process. But on the front end of the people we're trying to reach, they really need low commitment steps that have low relational requirements. And I'll tell you, the two things that really drive those steps are language and the space. And so, for example, you mentioned, Tony, you use the word membership. For the people we're trying to reach, the only thing they probably equate to membership is country club or some other kind of organization where they were a member at some time in their life. They have no idea what that even looks like in the context of the
mhm,
church. And so at our church, what we do is we talk about, hey, if you're brand new, and so by the way, every single week we have a path step, and it's actually it happens consecutively the first, second, third, and fourth Sunday of every month. And the first step we have is we call it new to victory, and this is the language that we have to use. That I say we have to. The speaking team has to do it. The ones that they're in person hosts is they say, listen, if you're a first time guest, that's your strategy. Go to the Connect Corner or guest services. If you're a returning guest, if you've been coming for a couple of weeks, a couple of months, never taken the next step, take 5 minutes and join us at New to Victory. That language, 5 minutes, is important
mhm.
because they know that we're probably not going to try to baptize them in 5 minutes. And they know that it's going to be a kind of a stand up meeting, come and go. So if they can do that, and then the second Sunday of every month is Discover Victory. Hey, take 15 minutes, 30,000-foot view of our church. You can ask any question that you like. And by the way, word on the street is we have some ooey gooey nutty butter bars or whatever. They always have some kind of treat
Yeah.
because you always have to ask the question, what's in it for them? And then lastly is Grow at Victory. And that is where we invite them to look at all the opportunities. And that's always the third Sunday. And it's about 30 minutes. And we always have, believe it or not, Tony, on a Sunday, we have a relationship. We have Chick-fil-A in the house on Sunday. And so we'll tell them, hey, Chick-fil-A is Jesus Chicken is in the house. Come to Grow. It's about 30 minutes. You're going to learn about all the opportunities. You can kick the tires. You don't have to buy the car. We want you to find the place that's right for you. And what I've learned about this is so many people at our church, especially when we really first started this about 3 years ago, people had been in our church for 2 years that
Mhm.
had never taken a step, that took these steps. And when I asked them why, you've been here 2 years, and they said, we really never had a step that we felt like we could take. And so the idea and the principle is when we think about steps for new people is we have to create steps that are low committal and low relationally enough that they can take it. And every time we can create one step for someone to take, it will give them courage to take a deeper step and finally become connected to the life of the church.
I love that. By the way, Chad, my favorite food incentive in recent months, crumble cookies. Do they have crumble cookies where you are?
Oh, we do have crumble cookies. Yes. And you're right. They will change your life.
I will do just about anything for a crumble cookie. So if you're a pastor listening, that may be the key to church health right there.
Well, if you ever visit our church, I will make sure crumble cookies are in the room so we can get you to take a next step, Tony.
All right, Chad, I really appreciate not only your service to our team, but your service to the kingdom, really, and what you and your church are doing to reach people for Jesus. So thanks for speaking into these mistakes that we're seeing in other churches related to guest services. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
Well, I always love listening to Chad share his wisdom because he has a gift for taking complicated principles and strategies and capturing the key thoughts in memorable phrases. And by the way, if you ever looked at our customer satisfaction, the churches that engage with Chad love him.
Yeah,
He's so
they
good
do.
at helping pastors just untangle those things.
Yeah.
But Tony, what stood out to you from that conversation?
Well, one of those phrases, memorable phrases that Chad shared was this one: guests aren't coming to buy the car, they're coming to kick the tires. And it's just good for us to remember that when someone's coming to visit for the very first time, they're not ready to make the purchase yet. They're still just kicking the tires. And because of that, I love, and we've talked about this a couple times in recent months, I love how Victory Hill Church is really intentional about these baby steps. And so he talked about having low commitment steps available that require low relational connection. And as far as first steps are concerned, so
Right.
we gotta encourage these first baby steps, and then later, as people continue to engage with our ministry, we can encourage them to take the bigger steps, which will involve more relational connection than at that point. So I love that. Again, the phrase was, "Guests aren't coming to buy the car; they're coming to kick the tires."
Well, Tony, any other final thoughts before we wrap up today's conversation?
Well, as Chad and I discussed, we offer a secret shopper portion of our Unstuck process where one of our ministry consultants helps you view your services through the eyes of an unchurched member of your community. And this is just one small part of the Unstuck process, but pastors often share this perspective from someone with fresh eyes is often transformative. And who knows, if we engage with your church, Chad might be your secret shopper. So if you want to learn more about what that process looks like, you can do that by going to theunstuckgroup.com, or let's just start a conversation, and you can start that conversation at theunstuckgroup.com/start.
Well, thanks for joining us on this week's podcast. If you like what you're hearing on the podcast and it's helped you in some way, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. And you can do that by subscribing on your favorite podcasting platform, giving us a review, and telling somebody else about the podcast. Next week, we're back with another brand new episode. Until then, have a great week.